Hello everybody! I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and I think it's time we talked about the art of the villain. Look, it's no secret that Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail has been pretty divisive, especially when it comes to its storytelling, pacing, and characters. However, one of my favorite elements of Final Fantasy XIV has always been the villains. We get a good mix between villains we love to hate, and then villains where we can really see where they're coming from, but we understand why we have to do what we have to do to them. And some of my favorite villains in all of gaming come from Final Fantasy XIV, namely, spoilers throughout this video, throughout Dawntrail, Emet-Selch, Medeion, and Xenos. I love those villains a lot, and I've made videos about each of those characters. But when it concerns Dawntrail, it's no secret that I have quite a few issues with the actual story that was told there. But funnily enough, one of the biggest saving graces of Dawntrail, for me, are two of its villains. I actually really like Sphene, though I understand why some people don't. And you may be expecting me to say Zoraal Ja here, but I'm not that big of a fan of his. Personally, I liked Bakool Ja Ja way more. I wouldn't put him even in B tier, he's a solid C tier villain for me. However, there's elements to his story I really liked, and I want to go into it. I want to talk about the villains of Dawntrail, why I like them, why I don't like them, and let's just break them down right now. Let's go in order and start with Bakool Ja Ja. Throughout most of the Reddit succession, I would say that I didn't like him as a character, because he's kind of just a stereotypical, I'm a bad guy. I'm not joking, his character introduction is basically him stepping on your actual tacos. He feels more like a Saturday morning cartoon villain than anything, to where he does evil things and hijinks for the sake of being evil, and they don't even have any real long-term benefits to him. Like that one time he freed Velagamanda to try and get a head start in the Reddit succession, he got blocked in the one in Yachtel when he had to make tacos anyways, because everyone had to be present for that. That was kind of funny in the moment, but it makes his entire storyline with Velagamanda just fall flat for me. You have him being a villain when it came to the bird people with the float, and just being the stereotypical villain of, oh, I'll just wait for the good guys to do something good then steal it from them. But where he really comes into his own and really shines, and has a massive turning point for me, to where he goes from a character that I actively disliked to a character I really came to appreciate and actually like, was in Yachtel in the Mamul area. The whole Blessed Sibling storyline, pacing wasn't the best, and honestly I kind of wish they took a bit more time with this part, but having this borderline survivor guilt complex, and feeling the weight of responsibility for all of these dead, failed blessed siblings is an interesting idea, and I think that in combination with the voice acting, his mannerisms, and the actual events of the Yachtel storyline there, makes that part in him really compelling. It does just lead to, he's a good guy now, ignore all the Yakhoi people he almost killed with Velagamanda. But I think one of the main reasons I came to like Bakool Ja Ja in this regard, and in this context specifically, is because, while it's not to the heights of, say, Emet-Selch, Xenos, Medeion, even Gaius, for me, he was an enjoyable character for that one arc, in a story that desperately needed more enjoyable characters. It was honestly the first part of the Dawntrail narrative that felt like it had genuine, interesting, emotional stakes. Velagamanda, sure he was a threat, sure we saw what he could do, at least the after effects, in the zone design of Ukapacha itself, but realistically speaking, we only really saw him in the block of ice or in the actual trial, and that was it. The whole blessed sibling angle had far more far-reaching ramifications, and to me was an interesting element of the Dawntrail story that I kind of wish was expanded on more, and going into that one dungeon and peering over the side into the water and seeing all the urns with all the dead kids in them, that's a really interesting dungeon design, and it was great. I think they should have foreshadowed this way more in a more interesting way. He shouldn't have been written as just a stereotypical cartoon villain. I think these elements of his narrative should have been explored and expanded on way early in the narrative, but what we did get, I thought was pretty good. Now, let's go over to Zoraal Ja. Why don't I like this character? Because he does nothing. So, throughout the Reddit succession, the only reason we are told that he's the villain is because we're told he's the villain. He doesn't do anything that particularly makes us fear him or worry about him. All he does really to showcase his strength is tame a golden alpaca, and we're told that it's supposed to be strong or whatever, but again, telling not showing is not an effective way to tell a story, especially in a video game. He talks about martial prowess and all that. Kryl huddles in fear as her echo shows her the abyss of his heart or whatever. But again, we're never shown elements of that through his character before the invasion angle after Shaloni. He stabs his friend at the Golden City, I guess, and he sneaks attack Ketenram, but we're not shown enough to really ever have this justified ominous feeling they're trying to instill with this character. And I don't think that it helps that the Jmulls Ja, as like character models, just don't particularly have good facial expressions, at least in my opinion. They all look kind of bleh, so to me I just kind of find it hard to be intimidated by them at all. And he talks about wanting to wage war with Eorzea and the entire world to try and bring it under his banner, but without showing us the might of the Turali army, or himself especially, it just feels like empty threats, especially after all that we have been through throughout A Realm Reborn all the way through Endwalker. Sure, he punches Bakool Ja Ja, but let's be fair, they don't even do him that much justice after that point either, where even Wook Lamont is able to clutch like a 1v50 against him. That doesn't make her seem strong, it just makes Bakool Ja Ja feel weak, more than anything at least. Which is kind of the point of his story, a little bit, at least in terms of his mental state, but you have all these little compounding issues that work off of each other to really diminish Zoraal Ja as a character for me. Then when he becomes the King of Alexandria, the King of Resolve, I thought he looked kind of stupid. Seeing him in the power armor, sure, you can make a funny comparison to Halo elites in this regard, but he kind of looks out of place. He looks more like he's cosplaying than being an actual threat. And like the one big feat that he has with killing Walkthroughs Ja Ja, it's compromised because nobody does anything about it. We all just like stare and watch him. And he gets absolutely clapped by Walkthroughs Ja Ja and is forced to rely on Alexandrian tech to be able to come out on top there, despite the fact we're all standing like 5 feet from him. We could have easily intervened and we don't. And again, this is supposed to go to his storyline about how he feels inferior compared to his father and all of his adopted siblings. I get that, but you have to show this. When he lost to the shade of Walkthroughs Ja Ja back in Yoctel, we arrive after the fact. So we don't know how that fight went. All we know is that he lost. It's telling, not showing. They should have showed us that fight, show him trying his best, but not being able to overcome even a shade of his father in his prime. And then when he's supposed to be this big bad threat, we watch him get absolutely clapped up by Walkthroughs Ja Ja. Despite the fact Zoraal Ja has all this like high-tech equipment, he is still forced to utilize an extra soul, and then a beast soul on top of it. And when we ourselves have already fought Walkthroughs Ja Ja twice, one in the 1v1 from before and the other one in Yoctel against the Shade, simply overcoming Walkthroughs Ja Ja is not that big of a threat to us. Because we kind of did it twice. And I know that the first time they try to play it off as if it was a draw, but I mean, come on. Even Estinian had him on the ropes, and then we came in. The point I'm trying to get across here is that the angle they went when it came to Zoraal Ja was they wanted him to feel like this big threat. A person who only cared about power for power's sake so that he could prove everyone wrong, at least in his own head. The problem is, when that is not properly showcased, it doesn't land nearly as hard, and comes off more like yapping instead of interesting and engaging storytelling. And when we ultimately defeat Zoraal Ja, they try and have this angle of he didn't feel worthy enough to be a father because of what Walkthroughs Ja Ja, or at least how he treated himself. And Dawntrail tries this a couple of times where they introduce this plot point that just does not feel good in the moment, and then try and have a line of dialogue afterwards to try and justify it. And that's never, in my opinion, a very interesting way to tell a story or to develop a character, because it lands hollow. It just doesn't resonate, at least for me. It feels more like an excuse than anything else instead of interesting and engaging character development, because the character's storyline is already pretty much done, and then you're trying to recontextualize everything at the last minute, and you're not doing an effective job at that. And I think it doesn't help at all that the character model of Zoraal Ja just does not come across when it comes to emotive storytelling through facial animations and just animations on the whole. He feels far too stoic for the kind of story they're trying to go for, and we don't get nearly enough scenes with him to properly develop this. It's a bunch of issues compounded together to create this larger problem that I have with the character. Now, what about Sphene? I really do like her as a villain and as a character overall. Her biggest issue is that Wook Lamont doesn't land as a character because she's supposed to act as as the foil to Wuklamot. She is supposed to serve as this kind of what-if scenario. Wuklamot is all about loving her people and trying to understand people. What if you take that too far? Well, you get Sphene, a person who well, not even a person at this point. This character that loves her people so much that it's essentially programmed into her mind to love her people and to put her people above everything else to preserve their happiness. And the difference between Wuklamot and Sphene is that Sphene views this happiness to be paramount even above everyone else's well-being. So she's willing to kill everyone else and forsake everyone else to preserve the happiness and the longevity of her own people, including the Endless. That's a really interesting story in my opinion. Does feel kind of reminiscent to Emmett Selk. And by kind of, I mean very. It's not exactly the same, right? There are some interesting little nuanced differences. Because Emmett Selk was trying to bring his people back, while Sphene's trying to preserve her own people. But when you already have Emmett Selk, and he's one of the best characters, in my opinion, ever made in Final Fantasy, and you try and do something similar to that, there's going to be a lot of people out there where it just doesn't land. Because they won't be able to get over, oh, this is a worse Emmett Selk. I was able to get over that because I liked Sphene as a character. My biggest issue is that Wuklamot's not a good character. Because when you do a villain like this who is intrinsically linked to the MC and is supposed to represent a bunch of what-ifs to the character growth of the MC, Wuklamot, if the MC is not compelling, then it undermines what you're trying to do with that villain. Because a lot of the effective storytelling they're trying to do with that villain hinges on the character of Wuklamot. And with Wuklamot suffering from Dawntrail just not having the most well-written dialogue ever, on top of, in my opinion, in the English voice acting, this is more of an issue on Dawntrail on the whole. I'm not a fan of the voice acting. Outside of Otis and Graha, obviously. There's an issue with voice direction, there's an issue with dialogue, the quality of the dialogue, the amount of dialogue Wuklamot has, the amount of screen time Wuklamot has as well. She's supposed to be the MC, but when you give her so much time with her and the dialogue does not feel well written and feels repetitive, with the themes and messaging ham-fisted into the dialogue so often, lacking subtlety, lacking intrigue, lacking emotional resonance, because the story relies on telling, not showing so often, it undermines that character. And when you're trying to do a villain that's supposed to work off that character, it undermines that villain. Now, I think Sphene is still a good character despite that. I do think when you have the themes of the story so forced into the dialogue and forced into the story, lacking subtlety, lacking that intriguing storytelling that Final Fantasy XIV have been known for, it compromises what you're trying to build here. But I do think a little bit of that is reintroduced with Sphene. The concept of the Endless is a really interesting one, especially in terms of what does it mean to be alive. Because they could easily recontextualize what we did in Living Memory to be that, oh, we didn't think that was an actual means of living, but because of the actual nature of Final Fantasy XIV, we essentially just wiped out a people. They could easily lean into that style of story. I don't think Sphene's story is entirely done because of the crown thing. We don't know where that's going to go. We don't know what's going to happen in regards to that. So it could easily be similar in vein to, say, Xenos from Stormblood. I know not everybody loves Xenos, but I love Xenos. He's one of my favorite characters, and I will not accept any criticism because I'm a Xenos stan until the day I die. Yeah, I am ride or die when it comes to him. But when you have the crown light up like that, it's clearly hinting at something in regards to that. We don't know what that could be, but they could easily use that as an idea saying, hey, Sphene in some form is coming back, and we could expand on the story there. So you always have that important caveat when it comes to that, because I think a lot of Xenos' character development actually came after he died in Stormblood 4.0. A lot of the reasons I really came to like and appreciate that character came after he came back, and something similar could easily happen with Sphene. We simply don't know right now. We can only work off the 7.0 narrative. But I think Alexandria brought to the table a bunch of interesting concepts, even storytelling-wise, with people forgetting the dead and all that. The whole concept of Electrope and how it can be applied throughout every aspect of life. All of Solution 9, Heritage Found, Living Memory. These are great locations with great stories and great, plot devices. So I think for me, I really liked the character of Sphene, and I liked it so much that I ended up liking her despite the fact that she's inherently tied to Wuklamot. because I could see what they were going for there, and I think they did a pretty good job, all things considered, with Sphene. And I think the biggest saving grace for me is that I knew what they were trying to do when it came to Wuklamot, so when they took those elements and tried to run with it when it came to Sphene, I was more easily able to see what they were going for and like it. But again, I don't think Sphene is like the highest tier villain in Final Fantasy XIV. I prefer characters like Xenos, Emet-Selch, Meteion. Now, granted, I think she was more compelling than Golbez, but I think for me, in a story that was largely lacking in interesting stakes and interesting elements, Sphene was kind of like a shining light in that regard. When I wanted really interesting things to happen with interesting stakes and interesting concepts being explored, Sphene largely provided those. So I think for me, she's my favorite villain in Dawntrail. Bakool Ja Ja became a character and a villain that I ended up liking when it got to Yaktel and the Mamulja pot, and then Zoraal Ja is just kind of this flaccid noodle hanging off the side of the table. I can understand why somebody likes or dislikes any of these three characters in any combination, because at the end of the day, storytelling is subjective and the way we react and experience stories is inherently subjective. I can only talk about how I feel about them and how I reacted to these characters and what I got out of them. And with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. Leave a comment down below with your favorite villain in all of Final Fantasy XIV, but also your favorite villain in Dawntrail, or why you didn't like a specific character. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and hear your perspectives. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again!